How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and today we're going to be taking a look at Modern Horizons 3 cards. I got a collection of what I think are the most potentially playable cEDH cards for Modern Horizons 3. Looking through the card file, not going to be going over every single card today. I think I hit most of the main hits though. There could be some sleepers in this set, especially with some of the weirder mechanics going around, but I think I hit the main things. We're not going to be talking super in depth about every single card because that's going to take a while, but kind of giving my initial reaction to where I think some cards will be, how playable they are, things like that. We will have a podcast episode probably coming out next week where we dive into MH3, and that's going to be a full 1 to 2 hour long deep dive on how we expect Modern Horizons 3 to affect this format. So if you're interested in that, subscribe, make sure you don't miss it. Let me know down below which cards you're most excited for coming out of Modern Horizons 3. As always, thank you to my amazing patrons over on Patreon who help support me, get to make more videos like this, get access to cool perks over there. Check that out in the description below if you're interested in that. With all that being said, let's go ahead and hop into it. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. This is one of the best ways you can support the channel, and again, it's just free stuff. Use the link in the description below, give Whatnot a try. So I expect that these tiers are pretty straightforward, especially compared to some of the other goofier tiers I've done and other things. Top tier, we got the busted cards. These are the, I'm not going to say like top 10 level cards in the format type of cards, but just like really strong staples that are like, you probably need a reason not to run. Types of things we don't usually see too much, just the best of the best. Then we got our staples, cards that are pretty strong in their colors. Sometimes if they don't work with the commander or don't really fit certain strategies, they might not show up, but it's not because they're not good. It's just because it's not lining up that great for the deck. Playable cards are the cards you'll see in maybe some lower color decks. Cards that maybe are a little bit more situational, come in and out of decks depending on what they're looking to address, things like that. Fringe playable, that, but taken to a lesser extent. The cards that are like, this works for this, you know, like monocolor commander, this commander specifically, blah, blah, blah. And then the cope / needs a new commander are cards that I don't really think are cEDH playable actually, but potentially do something unique enough to where they might be a consideration at some point if some synergy comes about or maybe new support comes for them. You might have to forgive me if I don't know the names of some of these cards. They'll be on the screen, but what I'm looking at, these cards are so tiny. But this is Warren Soultrader, a card that I was kind of high on when I initially revealed it and now am a little bit lower on. I think it's closer to like fringe playable, maybe misreading it, but again, the decks that are going to want it, pretty niche. And whether or not it's as broken in those decks as we maybe might expect initially is also up in the air. I talked about it in Corvold. Skirk Prospector being a whole 2 mana cheaper is a really nice upside. This, of course, being able to draw you 2 cards is really nice though. I'm not as knowledgeable on some of the like Mardu Dargo or Jund Dargo stuff and how much they want that. Maybe a little bit more because looping, sacrificing a thing is a little bit more useful. Pretty common over there. And things like Skirk Prospector aren't really involved there. Usually they're more likely to run something like Phyrexian Altar or Impact Tremor, stuff like that. So I think fringe playable is a good spot for it. I kind of feel the same with Ashling. This is mainly rating this as a commander. It does some cool things. You can do some cool stormy stuff. You know, it's going to have some of the same issues as the other very low color decks. Sometimes they can pop off in top 16 event, but there's a consistency issue. There's a lack of tutors in the colors, a lot of the good stuff you'd expect. Strix Serenade is a card I think is overhyped by the community. I'm going to put it into playable. It's a respectable enough card to run in your deck, but it's incredibly reactive. So this card is like the opposite of Swansong, where it hits creatures, planeswalkers, and artifacts. No battles though, but it's so reactive that like you can't put this in every deck. Like the Rog Size, the Analas, any proactively slanting blue deck. Like I'm not running, I don't want it in Rog Thras. I don't even know if I would want it in like Bruce Thras if I put that bad together. Maybe it makes more sense over there. The more reactive you are, the better it is, but this very rarely hits something that is stopping you from trying to win the game. Can hit a stack piece potentially, but usually hard removal works for that too. It's a fine enough card. Some decks will like it. The low color control shells will love it, I'm sure, but it's kind of whatever for me. I don't expect like the Timna Croms to really pick it up. It does very much power creep cards like Stern Scolding. So any deck that was running like Stern Scolding immediately just swaps this in for that. And that's like a big upgrade. So keep that in mind. Galvanic Discharge honestly could go like potentially in staple status because maybe the top of playable. I might put it in staple. Maybe I'll move it as we go along. And I might address this, not the most official tier list in the world, right? Because this thing is just Lightning Bolt. The downside of this card in 60 card 1v1 is it can't go face. Going face is like the most worthless mode in Commander though, and this thing is just like more flexible in a lot of ways. 99% of the time you're going to cast the Lightning Bolt targeting a creature or planeswalker in this format. Usually a creature, there are a couple planeswalkers, but if you're doing that, this is better than Lightning Bolt, because if you have any other energy card in your deck, and there's a few on this list, so we'll get to those, immediate upside. If I'm just using this on a Ragavan or an Oppo, something, with like a 2/2, there's a lot of X2s in this format. If I use it on that and I have an energy left over, that's just upside for something else that I might cast later. It's also just upside for this card. Like if you're an Underworld Breach deck and you might escape it later, you can escape it and hit, if I use it for 2 now, I can use it for 4 later. If you're an Eternal Witness deck, buy it back. Use it to kill some X1 like a Bowmaster, then use it to kill an X5. Like, you kill anything with this. It basically becomes like red Sword Plowshares once it gets to like 5-6. If you Twister, get it back in your deck. If you Endurance, get it back in your deck. Any way that you might recast it, and most decks will have a way to do it, that might not come up the most like every single game, but because it has that upside of Lightning Bolt and the incredibly small downside of not being able to go face, I actually think this is mostly for our format a Power Corrupt Lightning Bolt. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. Leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. Amphibian Downpour, I think, is playable. I talked about this card in my little preview thing and compared it to something like March of Swirling Mist and Dress Down. Another cool part of it I didn't really mention is the ability to just have it basically be Flusterstorm as a removal spell where, there's a little stack war. People cast like 2-3 spells, whatever. And then in step, if you would try to like sword something or whatever, even Dress Down, the fact that this is going to make 3 copies and you can like just target the same creature and just be almost guaranteed for sure that creature is not going to be an issue going into your turn. It's pretty big. It is on the pricier side, but I think in that slot, the Dress Down March of Swirling Mist slot, it's going to be a consideration. This is where I would put that card too. Like, that's a very playable card. It's respectable, not busted, doesn't show up everywhere. But yeah, be careful because it feeds Docksides really hard. But hey, it also increases your devotion to blue, so keep that in mind. Next up is Ghostfire Slice. Again, in some ways, it's like an upgraded Bolt, but it's pretty fringe. It might be Cope, actually. I think for mono red decks, you just run this as a nice removal option. It's really good competing with something like Rending Volley, but the ability to just kill target commander for the most part is kind of nice for just 1 mana, but the amount of like multicolored creatures that aren't commanders in this format is really low compared to like casual. I think this one's pretty fringe. Maybe it's fringe enough to go into Cope, but I think like 1 to 2 color red decks, this is a reasonable consideration. Glimpse the Unthinkable is really cool in certain decks. If you care about casting from exile, it's pretty sick. If you care about sacrificing things, it's pretty nice. It's pretty pushed. If it was any cheaper, if they just brought down all the numbers to 2, like it was 2 mana, did this for 2, made 2 things, it might be even better. I think this one goes towards the middle of fringe. It's again like a low color deck thing or like a high synergy kind of thing where if this card makes sense in your deck, you're pretty excited to run it. Otherwise, it doesn't give you enough stuff, I don't think, to really push you to run it over a card like Jessica's Will, which isn't even really staple status for a lot of decks, but it does some pretty cool stuff. Flare of Denial. This one, I believe, goes into staple status. I know a lot of people are lower on this card because of relatively large cost of sacrificing a blue creature, potentially being, based on your deck, very high cost, right? In Tim Necrom, this card isn't a consideration at all. Good. I don't want them to get any cards. Frick them. Lower color decks, low color Thrasios decks. I think it's just kind of a banger. My testing with it in Rock Thras, it's been great. We have a lot of times Thrasios can get sacked. I don't care. Cards like Spellseeker, Trophy Mage, whatever, even a Kennen potentially sitting around. Sometimes it's worth trading that for a counterspell. And it's a new piece of free interaction, which is super nice. I've even found, not less so with this one, but especially with some of the other flares, the ability to interact while also getting rid of something. Like when we talk about the red flare, being able to sacrifice your dockside, less concern of like leaving a dockside around for other people. And also you can get it back from the graveyard in a lot of decks. Not going to be in every single deck. Like I said, doesn't have to to be a staple. But the decks that want this card will probably run it from now until the end of Magic, basically. Next up, we have Disciple of Rhonas, which I think is maybe Cope, honestly. Based on my initial assessment of it, it's basically Dargo or bust with it. Maybe I'm wrong on this one, but like, I don't know. I play against Dargo Thras a lot. It doesn't just have a Dargo lying around all that often. And I guess it is really nice for your big setup turn. It being a 1/4 is pretty huge because it's like kind of in competition with something like a Bloom Tender. And Bloom Tender is, you know, pretty bad against Bowmasters. So maybe it's closer to like Fringe playable. That one's kind of tough. It maybe even could go to playable just because it being a 2-mana dork isn't that low of a downside. Again, like you need a power 4 greater creature kind of in the zone for this to be reasonable. So Fringe playable to me, not necessarily a weak card, but just super situational with what decks you're going to put it into. Next up, we got Magus of the Blue. I think it's actually called Harbinger of the Seas. I'm going to just stay on brand here and just say that these kind of effects are coping throughout the game. This one I think less so because it is more likely to shut off a more problematic deck at the table because it's turning off red, which is, you know, busted, right? Blood Moon or Magus, pass the turn, cast Dockside Extortionist. This one making it harder to cast Dockside. Kind of nice, but there's just not a successful deck that looks like it'll use anything like this. Maybe Kinnan, if they're leaning Staxy and they're already kind of on the downtick. I don't know if they necessarily want this. They're like a Cradle deck, right? So there could be a pretty powerful new like 2-color blue commander that like actually is really good and utilizes this card well, right? If we got like, I don't know, a blue Winota variant, basically. I don't know. I don't think this is very good. Necrodominance, probably the bottom of playable. Arguably, maybe even goes into Fringe playable. But I think what this card does, when this card does its thing, is just better than the upside of a lot of these other cards. Turbo decks will be running it. They will be trying it, especially the lower color you get, more into that like Rakdos, whatever, pie. Card just becomes more and more of a consideration. It's just pretty good. Got a lot of downsides. It is worse Necro. But you know, Necro's really been underrated by the community at large for a while. People are only in the last year or so really pushing Necro and putting it into more decks and realizing how busted it is. So Unstable Amulet, it looks like a really strong Obnixilis card and pretty much terrible anywhere else. I'm going to stick it on here just to acknowledge it because we're probably not going to talk about it in our podcast thing, but I don't think you'll see it anywhere else unless somehow I get surprised and there is an energy deck. Again, it does overlap really well with like a deck like Obnix that loves running lots of removal to deal with things like Dranth Magistrate. It lines up there where there is going to be, you know, if you're running more and more of these pieces, there is some good stuff and we'll get more into that. So I do think we might see a little bit of a red energy package actually show up in cEDH and maybe blue-red, maybe black-red too. Keep your eyes out on that. Powerbalance. I want to put this into busted just because I love it, but I think it's like staple. I'm going with staple. I haven't gotten any reps with this deck, with this like most of these cards. Some of them I have, but there's super strong synergies with top. It looks like super sick in the decks that are already running like top Citadel stuff. Powerbalance is a card to watch out for. Being able to just draw a card every time someone casts a 1-mana spell if you have top out, it's pretty sick. Yeah, it's proactively good in a Ristic Mystic kind of way, you know, just seems strong. The White Flare has some really interesting interactions, can be good, but like I talked about in my video where this got revealed, I think this just doesn't line up that well, right? You're sacrificing a white creature to protect creatures, can protect your other permanents, right? Somebody goes to blow up a Ristic, you can sack an Esper Sentinel to protect it. I think it's cope. Probably better than this card. It seems that it's best in a low color white deck, and there isn't a successful low color white deck currently. This card, again, if there's like a resurgence of like a deck like Winota or something similar to it, or another like, you know, some blue-white deck shows up creature heavy or whatever, this could shoot up to playable. Doesn't look like it's actually going to work out. Wheel of Potential is a card I was really low on but the more I see like how many playable energy cards are in here, I think it's like the very tippy top of Fringe playable, maybe even just straight up playable. Depends on how Fringe you consider like proactive Rakdos X decks. I don't think like a Rog Sai is going to run this, you know, there's none of the other energy cards are considerations for that deck. The Obnixilises of the world, Prospers, whatever. This card is like close. When you get to do the big thing with all the energy, it's really busted. So I think it's pretty close to just straight up playable. I'm going to put it into Fringe playable for now, with the caveat that like if the energy package actually ends up lining up well, especially with like some of the commander stuff that I haven't got to take a look at yet, because we're just looking at MH3 proper, not commander today. Maybe this goes straight up to playable. Nadu. This is as a commander. I'm going to say top of playable. I thought about doing a full video on this commander commander. If you think that is something you'd like to see, let me know. This is looking like a pretty real Simic commander that just does a ton. Messing around with it, it's really easy to see it just like turn 2, do a little mini Nas or like a little contract from below, whatever, like a one-sided wheel basically of just get this thing down with something that can target a bunch of stuff, and then you just draw like 3 cards, put a land or 2 into play. If you hit a Scoot Swarm, you basically just win the game. It has a lot of synergies with honestly pretty bad cards, but I think this is one where at first it might be on the cutesier side of how it should be built, and then as people refine it, potentially staple. I mean, there's only Kinnan to compete with in the blue-green sphere right now, and it's not really the best performer. And also it's really cool that this is a blue-green commander that is actively bad to Bowmaster, which is pretty hot. So I think kind of on the top end of playable. I expect this deck to be around, snag some top 16s, kind of in that Stella Lee tier. It's a little bit easier to win with Stella Lee. It's a little bit easier to grind with this commander. So we'll kind of see how it is. Birthing Ritual, I think, is just pure cope. I really like the card. It gets you a lot of chances to look at something. Maybe it goes into fringe playable because I think the low color green decks will just rock it. Notably not as broken as Pod. I think the smaller your deck is, right? The 60 card formats, it's a better card. Getting the mana reduction on it doesn't make it worth it, really, in my mind. It being end of turn means this can only really be like pretty value oriented. So I think this is just not quite here in a format where Birthing Pod barely sees play. Evolution Witness is like really fringe playable. It has a combo with whatever, this card here on the screen. I don't know its name. You can run it in Black Thrasios decks. It's actually a pretty cheap combo for an A+B. I expect this one to be like a flash in the pan thing. You might see it first. There's not a lot of decks that are green and black that are doing, you know, like leaning, that are like that kind of thing. I don't know. Seems fine. 6 might just be busted. 6 is like a little Underworld Breach. It's not even necessarily the Underworld Breach at home. It's like Underworld Breach that works with Underworld Breach really well. Might be overrating this card. I think it is only contextually busted. Not every deck can run it because not every deck is green, but like every green deck I think wants it. Of all the ones I've looked at, it just seems really nice. Like green decks tend to be higher on lands. They tend to like to take advantage of permanents. It's just a really strong recursive ability that doesn't need to like be explosive necessarily, right? You can just play this card out is the thing. Like if you're comparing it to Breach, right? Obviously Underworld Breach is a much more powerful card, but Underworld Breach is also like, you know, you're not going to turn 1 Breach pass because that doesn't work. That's a combo card. It needs other cards to do something. You could just lead on 6 as a value engine to just help me hit my land drops. If I'm flooded, it's going to mill me over some cards and I can throw a land away and then buy back something. And then in combo turns, it's just cracked. Like being able to like, oh, you countered my thing. Let me try to recast it from the yard by pitching a land. I think this card's just cracked. Maybe this would be like on the low end of busted if there were more things on here. But like, I don't know. It seems pretty strong to me. I really liked it. Sowing Mycospawn, I think, is more playable than people might see this card and not even think about it for cEDH, but like maybe I'm just rock thrash pilled. But like if you're a Cradle deck, especially a low color one, like the same rate as Expedition Map, it puts the land straight into play and it's untapped and it's a cast trigger. It's basically like if I was going to Expedition Map, I have to save my land drop. And then, but this, I can play that land that like if I have a land in hand, play that, then it's basically the same amount of mana because I saved a land drop. Like I went up a land to do it. Doesn't have the flexibility that that card has to be able to like crack it instant speed, go get Beseiju, something like that. But low color green decks, I mean, they're just guys Cradle.deck, most of them. Springheart Nantuko, I think is his card's name. I think it's playable. So we're getting a lot of green stuff in this set, and a lot of it is very land-centric, as you can see. I don't know what decks will utilize this the best. Again, it's looking like something that'll line up well in those teamer piles. Just like bestow this onto a dockside. Every time I play a land, I get a dockside. Or less broken, you know, every time I do this, I get a Spellseeker. Every time I do this, I get a Imperial Recruiter. Like, there's just a lot of ETBs. You know, this is, the more you're doing that kind of stuff, like, these cards are overlapping well, and with some cards also that we'll go over. But, like, I don't know. It just seems strong enough for those piles. You're running enough creatures to where, and especially if you're doing the Cradle thing, you're doing the Dork thing, you know, making enough mana to where paying an extra 2 to get, like, an extra tutor whenever I, you know, like, whenever I fetch, just get an extra Imperial Recruiter, get an extra Spellseeker. Like, it doesn't have to be Dockside. Also, at the very least, even if you don't do that, you just generate a body. So if you are doing that Cradle thing or Paradise Mantle, whatever, taking advantage of creatures in play, works well with that. This card is obviously really good with Nadu. Just seems pretty strong. It maybe should be like closer to fringe playable, but I just make the cut. Vexing Bauble is a really interesting one. This one was one people kept asking me about, and I wasn't really sure how to evaluate it. My gut reaction is somewhere around here in terms of playability. Lavinia sees play despite how bad it is a lot of times. You know, Boromir was seeing play a lot in TNK, and those are at a pretty rough rate. Vexing Bauble having the upside that Boromir has of, hey, I can just sacrifice if I need to. Cantripping on top of that. You're not even losing anything really. Being purely colorless, meaning it can go in every deck. This seems like kind of the perfect way to do this effect if you want it to be playable, beyond like doing it at this rate, and then also it's asymmetrical. That would be bonkers. It would be in busted tier for sure. I could honestly see it moving up to staple potentially. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, right? People were talking about using it in proactive decks and just like throwing your hand on the table, you know, on the play or second or whatever, and then ending with this, it kind of being like a Mystic Grimoire, right? Where it's like reverse card advantage, where I play this for like 1 mana and now you guys can't play anything. Not because you don't want to feed me, but because your cards don't work anymore. And also, you know, turns off the fierces, the forces, you know, especially in those proactive decks, it can kind of be like a defense grid. So where this card lines up, I'm not really sure. It could just be everywhere. This could be my biggest misassessment of one of these, or biggest misreads, where it could actually be busted, or it could just be cope. Don't be surprised if it starts showing up in a lot of decks, and maybe it's closer to that staple tier though. Shifting Woodland, my initial assessment was busted. I think it's closer to like the tippy top of staple. Green decks, I think almost without question forever, beyond like the really fast ones, will play this, especially if you're a crop rot deck already. It's really good. It works amazingly with crop rot too, because you get two card types in the yard just off of that. I don't know, it seems so good. Like, I think in other formats it's busted. Here the 4 mana is not too much of an ask to potentially buy back something really busted. It's really nice that it can like get you back a combo piece if that gets interacted with, right? Somebody kills your Kennen or something and just like, okay, my land is a Kennen, tap Assault Monolith. Just seems really good. I don't know if it's quite in busted tier. I noticed in my testing it was coming in tapped a little bit more often than I expected. Delirium, you might not hit that quickly in a lot of those decks, I found, but you hit it eventually, and the card is just busted when you do. And then just more often than not, untapped green source. Invert Polarity. It looked like she said strict puberty to me. Invert Polarity, really cool cope. It probably doesn't need new commander. Probably correct players are going to play it. The upside is so good, except it sucks against counterspells, which is what a lot of counterspells are even hitting to begin with. I think fringe playable. Mana costs suck. 3 pips, blue, red. Jesus, terrible. If you're in Izzet, that's not as bad. Holding up Izzet colors is kind of rough. Holding up this mana is tough. You want to hit something pretty specific with it. You really want to hit like an Ad Nauseam or an Underworld Breach, maybe. Dockside Extortionist, whatever. Like, you want to hit something proactively good with it. It's almost more like a control-y kind of card. It's a little hard to evaluate. Sink into Stupor, I think, is perfectly playable. If you're in a mainly lower color blue deck, I think no one above 3 colors wants to run this. Of the ones of these, you could kind of lump in the rest of these single color MDFCs into this tier. Front side of this one specifically has 2 pretty impactful modes. Bounce spells are a lot better here than the RN60 card. Seems pretty good. Untapped land on the back is just so huge. The 2 color MDFCs, this one is like the only remotely playable one, I think. And it's probably like hope. It's just so expensive, and the tap land on the back of it, not great. Tutor is like, it being instant speed is nice, direct to hand is nice, but 4 mana is rough. It seems like a mid, 102nd card in a blue-black control list, of which there's like 1 successful one. Primal, I think, is also maybe in that cope tier. Allurin is, pretty much better. This is one-sided, but also got a lot more of a downside. I think even if you're running the energy package, it isn't quite there. There's like some combo-y stuff you can do, but like, I think you're really contorting to try to make this card work, where like the downside of Allurin being, symmetrical for everyone isn't always that big of a deal, because people might not often have a thing to flash into play that is super relevant for the board state, depending on the matchup. seems just kind of, I think this one's on cope. Like, it just seems like you're going to do too much for a card that costs a little bit too much to try to combo with bad cards you weren't running to begin with. When you could just, if you're really in that space, could just do like a learn stuff. Maybe this could show up in like decks that are already doing that. There aren't really successful ones doing it. I don't think this quite gets there, and it doesn't necessarily overlap amazingly with the other playable energy cards either, which this is one. Volatile Stormdrake. Playable, high end of playable. Pretty much a Gilded Drake. Doesn't hit the biggest stuff. Take control of something that costs 4 or less. That's most of the things. Can't hit Crom, which is a downside. If you're really high on the Gilded Drake type effect, which a lot more decks I think are now, it's kind of coming back into favor. Or I think especially if you want to play Gilded Drake and you don't want to spend $200 to $300 on one, this is a perfectly fine Gilded Drake impression. You could still hit most of those 4 mana commanders, Tymna's, Nagila's, a lot of the big stuff. It also does have the upside too of being a removal spell. So it does have something that Drake can't quite do, which is when this enters, you do the exchange and then you pay the energy if you want to keep the creature. If not, the creature dies. You have to sack it. Stax Beast, for instance. You can play this as a 2 mana creature removal spell. I really like it. Maybe could even be on the bottom end of staple. I don't know. I think high end of playable, it looks good. Chthonian Nightmare is a little tough to evaluate because it's really, really strong in the decks that want it, but it isn't necessarily wanted in every single deck. But I think at the power level that it's at, I'm supposed to put it into staple. It's not a staple in every deck. Don't be going crazy now. But your Corvold decks, some of your Dargo decks, your Thras Vials potentially, Kinriths, a lot of the decks that are looking to do any kind of dockside looping shenanigans, any kind of reanimation shenanigans. This is basically a better recurring nightmare for any deck looking to do dockside looping outside of, it's a little bit easier to interact with because it has that ETB. It also lines up really well with those playable energy cards we talked about, your Drakes, Energy Bolts. That downside gets a little bit lessened by that, but it just being 2 mana recurring nightmare for the purposes of dockside looping, pretty huge. That's a banned card that if it came off the ban list would be playable in our format. And this, especially if they don't have like enchantment removal or something to respond to the ETB, is an upgrade for those kind of loops. Flare of Duplication. Busted. I'm saying it. He said it. Call the police, whatever you want to do. If you don't have a creature lying around to sacrifice for it, of course it's not the best thing in the world, but Force the Will, you don't always have a blue card. Chump. I don't know what to tell you. The biggest thing with this card, as you probably already know, is that with Rograk, son of Rogah, it's just always online. And I found that it seems quite strong in like Rogsai because it's kind of a new gas card at instant speed. That deck sacrifices its Roger a lot, like we've talked about. And so there's a bit of pressure on it, this card to work. You kind of have to cut a card like Infernal Plunge or something to make it make more sense. Decks like Rog Thras, any other Roger deck, Sans Black or whatever, that has less pressure on its Rog, this is such a massive upgrade. Like we literally in Rog Thras run nothing that sacrifices him. You could just use this and just throw it away to like copy a Demonic Tutor on turn 1 and it's worth it. That's good enough. I will exchange Roger for your Demonic Tutor. Perfectly fine for me. And then the upside, of course, being like copy your Naz. Boom, I win the game. Copy your Silence and then let that one resolve. Crop Rot, Born, whatever, win on top of you. Even being able to do like hold up a Fierce. Cast Fierce on your thing. Oh, you Fierce back? Okay, Flare of Duplication, copy Fierce. Especially in the partner decks, again, where if you have a red cheap commander that's easily expendable, those Fierce and Swats and Rollicks or whatever might be online from other commanders. I think the Flare cycle is like at its best in Rog Thras. There's some other commanders that can take advantage of it. Like you look at a deck like Magda. This is nuts in Magda. All of your dwarves basically are like a super deflecting SWAT now. Like all of them are just, this is Magda. Then also like just sack a thing, copy the thing with, even if he's got to be Magda, like whatever. If you're in a creature heavy deck, you might not have a ton of red creatures, but if you just have some lying around, I've already noted in just the few little bits of testing I've done that I get into situations where I can sacrifice Dockside to copy the thing, sacrifice Imperial Recruiter, get those cards back in my yard, get them to be non-clonable now. I think it's cracked. I think it's really, really, really cracked. Again, not every deck can run it. Screw you, Tymnacrom. You don't need it, but like it's super busted in the decks that make sense. Next up is Static Prison, which is a card I have not heard anyone talk about whatsoever in the context of cEDH, and wasn't even on my initial list, but as I was looking through the card file and thinking about it, looks really strong. So it's 1 mana, ETB, exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, you get 2 energy, and then at the beginning of pre-combat main phase, you have to sack it unless you pay 1 energy. So on the face, This thing is basically 1 mana, ETB, exile anything in play. And then on my next turn, I have to pay 1 energy to keep it gone. And then on my next turn, I have to pay 1 energy again to keep it gone. And then on that next turn, the third turn, if I haven't paid an energy, then that thing comes back. So 3 turns is a pretty long freaking time in cEDH. If you use this, you know, you're not that likely to use it on turn 1. So using it on like turn 2 or 3 when something problematic has come down, it's going to stay unless it gets removed itself until turn 5, maybe, you know, someone else's turn 6. And then if you make any energy, the thing's just staying around. Kind of an interesting part of it is if they remove this, like most of the ways to remove this card would be bouncing it. If they bounce this and you had any energy left over, the next thing that you exile is staying gone even longer. And then if you're running the cards like the, you know, Galvanic Discharge or the Volatile Stormdrake, it's going to stay forever. I think this might be like cEDH's Leyline Binding. 1 mana, get rid of anything for 3 turns or whatever is so good. I actually think this is just being underrated or just overlooked by the community and might just straight up be a staple of the format going forward. Ripples of Undeath, I think, is closer to like middle of Fringe, maybe top of Cope. I don't know that there's a deck currently that wants this effect, but I actually don't think it's bad. I think this is like a perfectly fine card. Maybe we're just going to see a resurgence of Gitrog. I'll put it in a Fringe. We'll put it in low into Fringe because I think there's somebody out there that wants this card and it's pretty good value engine. It's kind of like a Sylvan Library at home. I talked about it in the video where it first got leaked. Maybe that's Cope because like a Sylvan Library at home, we barely run Sylvan Library, but like being able to buy back stuff from the graveyard, you see all the cards before you decide to spend the mana. You're milling stuff anyways, which is good. Like any kind of grindier graveyard focused deck just seems like good there. It's just a card that I think you might see a little bit more than you expect. Next up, we have Disruptor Flute, which is 2 mana flash. As it enters, choose a card name. Spells with the name chosen cost 3 more, and activate abilities of sources with the name chosen can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. So kind of like a instant speed, tax a thing, and or shut off activated abilities. I think the instant speed and the flexibility actually makes this pretty interesting. Pithing Needle doesn't see a lot of play here because of how niche it is, and often like the most pithing needleable things are like slower resource generating commanders or cards out of the deck that you're just kind of blindly naming because you don't want to deal with them. I think this one is kind of fringe still, maybe even like the lowest side of playable, especially in lower color decks. Again, it's really reactive, and usually unless it's busted, I think you have to be sus on some reactive cards are just sus in general, right? They have to be busted to be good, but it's so flexible and it works in response to the thing. Like if they cast like whatever Basalt Monolith or something, then you can just use it in response naming Basalt Monolith. You can also just use it naming a commander you don't want to see come down, and that commander costs 3 more. Like it's maybe like the best fringe card. And I think Winter Moon is that same deal where I don't know what deck wants it. There are decks that run similar effects, but they're like not the best performing. But there's enough new like stacksy pieces here that I think we might just see it kind of pop up. It hitting like only non-basic lands means a deck like Magda might be more interested in this. This might just go into playable. It might just be like the bottom of playable as an interesting new stacks piece that doesn't like throw the game as much to somebody like a Blood Moon can. Is like really easy to break yourself. Can slot into any color deck, right? You can be mono green and run this, or a not very greedy like 2-color deck list that can run it. Maybe should be closer to fringe playable or something like that, but maybe this you can move down a little bit. I don't know. I kind of just expect a little bit more of like this kind of stacksier stuff to show up here. And then last up, we have Arena of Glory, which is the red land in the like shifting woodland cycle. I think is a pretty nice fringe option, maybe playable above Winter Moon, because you will see this in like your Godos and probably your Magdas and a lot of creature combo-y decks. It has a pretty interesting effect. Being able to split the mana up is kind of nice to give 2 things haste. All the places this might see play, I'm not really sure of. And I don't think there's like a top tier deck that wants it. So maybe it's closer to fringe playable, but the Magdas being able to give like 2 dwarves haste is kind of cracked. Any monocolor red deck, this is just like such a slam dunk to run in the deck. So card I expect to pop up, maybe won't be like the biggest game changer, but like it'll show up every now and then. So folks, this is my tier list. I think I'm fine with where everything is. I'd maybe move this here. This might go over Serenade. This might go under like these ones. Winter Moon, I'm still not sure on. The Flare might be better than these cards. You could maybe put down this as being so fringe it is Coke. Let me know what you think of the list. Let me know what cards you're most excited about in MH3, what decks you're brewing, all that good stuff. Which ones we should highlight in our podcast episode going over the set. Really excited for this set. Looking forward to the shakeups. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.